We would like to start the plenary today with a video, Our Past Can Shape Our Future.
I'm Representative Robert Pilot of the Ho-Chunk Nation, the people of the Big Voice. We've called this area home for thousands of years, but the beauty was created thousands of years before that. Let's travel back in time, way back, before Wisconsin was a state, before the United States was a country, way before Greek and Roman empires, and even before Ho-Chunk arrived to this sacred part of the world. We're here in Greater Madison, 15,000 years ago, but we're not standing on the ground. We're on top of a mountain of ice up to a mile thick. This is the Wisconsin glaciation, and it covered most of Canada, the upper Midwest, and New England, but a thaw is on the horizon. Over the next 2,000 years, we will witness the big glaciers start to melt and retreat. Where we once stood on ice is now a large lake stretching from present-day Middleton to Stout. Enter humans. 13,000 years ago, we would see the first human activity occurring around the shores of these waters. But the lakes hadn't divided yet, meaning distant ancestors of Ho-Chunk dwelled near a large, single water body later named Glacial Lake Yahara by geologists. But more change is coming. Moving to 10,000 years before present, we see water levels fall, separating into 4 current lakes and leaving shallow water marshes, including one that would later be turned into Lake Wingra. Along the area that the Ho-Chunk called Dejop, which translates to 4 lakes, early surveyors document the Ho-Chunk producing over 3,000 bushels of corn annually in Old Turtle, 4 Lakes, and Broken Arm, now known as Middleton, Madison, and Monona. At the center of Dejop, much like today, sits Lake Mendota, now known as the most studied lake in the world. The lake was once called Wakshak Ominga, translating to where the person rests. Dejop was a cultural epicenter for native mound building peoples, with evidence of over 1,200 effigy and burial mounds documented in the area, a concentration that rivals any other place in North America. The water is sacred too. The Ho-Chunk, with its massive ancestral land base throughout present-day Wisconsin and reaching areas of Canada and the Dakotas and into present-day Indiana, know the water has identity, a life, a meaning and a purpose, deserving the utmost care and protection. They rely on water for fishing, wild rice harvesting, and transportation, but also treat it with a spiritual reverence as a living entity that provides so much to the people of Dejop and beyond. That important relationship with water has lasted centuries, and it has kept the Ho-Chunk Nation from its traditional clan duties to its modern-day government as protectors of one of the most important life resources. This is why the Ho-Chunk pour tobacco for the water spirits. In return, the water protects the people. It's been 13,000 years since humans first congregated here. The future holds promise, but perhaps the past can offer lessons to how we develop relationships with our lands and waters. As we move forward to make our lakes better, we must also look back and draw upon the lessons learned from the Ho-Chunk, who knew the protection and reverence to the water would in turn lead to a thriving community.
Thank you. It is my absolute privilege today to introduce Dr. Stephanie Quinn Davidson. Dr. Quinn Davidson is a fisheries scientist and has worked in salmon fisheries for over a decade. Her work focuses on protecting and sustaining fisheries, elevating Indigenous perspectives and voices in cultural and natural resource policy, management, and advocacy. She is an enrolled member of the Brotherton Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. Currently, Stephanie is the Restoration Policy Manager for the Indigenous Conservation Group, Ridges to Riffles, working with tribes along the Klamath River on dam removal and river restoration. She has also served as Program Director for Fisheries and Communities with Alaska Venture Fund, Director of the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission with the Tanana Chiefs Conference, and a Fisheries Manager for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Before moving to Alaska, Stephanie was professor at St. Olaf College, where I was fortunate enough to have her as a mentor. She was also president of the Alaska chapter of the American Fisheries Society. Dr. Quinn Davidson received her bachelor's degree from Grinnell College and her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And joining Stephanie today in her talk is Brooke Woods. Brooke is a Rampart Village tribal member who received a Tribal Management Associate of Applied Sciences degree in 2017 and is now completing a bachelor's degree in Fisheries Science. Brooke is employed with the Woodwell Climate Research Center as the Climate Adaptation Specialist for the Permafrost Pathways project. She also served as executive chair for the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission and is a program advisor for the Indigenizing Salmon Management Project and the Thaw Mama Thaw program. The goal of the Indigenizing Salmon Management Project is to use deeply participatory approaches to document Indigenous values, knowledge, and management and governance structures around salmon and use that collected wisdom to improve current salmon systems. Thaw Mama Thaw is centered on elevating over 14,000 years of Indigenous stewardship, bringing Indigenous and Western science together to transform graduate education and research. Today, Stephanie and Brooke will be speaking to us on incorporating Indigenous perspectives in water resources and fisheries policy and management. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Quinn Davidson to the stage.
Akwai, Stephanie Quinn Davidson, Nui Siwank, Noeai Apayu Nyotayo Kisk. I just introduced myself in my traditional language. I am Brotherton Indian, born and raised here in Wisconsin. I currently live and work on the traditional lands of the Nishanan people of Northern California, and I'm very honored to be here with you today on Ho-Chunk lands. I am wearing today a traditional kuspuk made by a Yupik woman from St. Mary's, Alaska on the Yukon River. Thank you to Grace and Jake for the invitation to join you all today. And thank you, Grace, for that introduction. If Grace had not gone on to become a successful aquatic ecologist, I'm sure that she would have had a fascinating career as a science comic strip artist. Grace was in a stable isotope ecology seminar I taught, and I've been holding on to this comic for 15 years. And I finally have a use for it. How fitting that in this comic, the isotope superhero portrayed is carbon-based, and two, the electron trap has cheese in it. Grace was destined to be a cheesehead, working with carbon-stable isotopes, whether she knew it or not. I haven't called myself a limnologist for quite some time, despite still proudly displaying my Have You Hugged a Limnologist sticker today on my truck. My career has truly evolved over the years, from academia to fisheries management and research, to working in the public sector in Alaska for tribes, to protecting their traditional way of life, and now working on with an Indigenous conservation organization on the largest dam removal effort in the world on the Klamath River. I went from doing the science to applying the science, to communicating and advocating using the science. For the grad students in the room wondering where your path may take you, from my experience, it could be anywhere. I have nothing in my work today that I do that relates to the PhD research that I published. But I honestly wouldn't be here today had I not gotten that PhD, so I'm very grateful. I was honored when Grace and Jake asked me to be here with you today, but I really struggled with what my research or what my presentation would be. I've been out of the research world for many years now. I haven't published since I left graduate school. I have no body of scholarly work to draw on or cite. But Grace said, we want to know how to make our research matter. So I have my lived experience of working with tribes in Alaska on natural resource, primarily fisheries issues that I can draw from. You won't see many studies cited in this talk today, and I haven't published any kind of formal framework for working with tribes. My talk, though, is just sharing with you the Yukon River story, Brooke Woods' salmon story, the story that is all too common across Indian country about how the climate crisis is impacting frontline communities and peoples. I'll wrap up with some insights that I hope will shift your mindset on how to approach your aquatic research moving forward. When I went to the ASLO website for inspiration on this talk, the portion of the meeting program that stood out for me was this here. Climate change is here, it's happening faster than we can understand its impacts, and as aquatic scientists, you all know the struggle to keep up. So as it states on the webpage, effectively adapting to meet these challenges will require major transitions in both our thinking and how we manage aquatic ecosystems to build resilience. Sustainable solutions, those that work across sectors, nations, and generations, will emerge from a foundation of actionable aquatic science. The key parts for me here are the need to transition our thinking and how we manage aquatic ecosystems to build resilience. Major transitions in our thinking and approach are going to be necessary to tackle the most pressing climate challenges. There are so many interesting, scientifically fascinating climate research questions out there, but which ones are the priority? We can't possibly fight the fire on all sides. So I ask, are we fighting the fire on the right side where it's growing the fastest? The other parts of these statements that stood out for me were resilience and actionable. And my first thought was resilience for who? Actionable science for who? Who's in most need of resiliency and who could and should benefit the most from actionable science? Do I, an upper middle class, white presenting, educated professional with a stable financial future and the ability to move my home and family should I need to because of flooding or wildfires or any other climate disaster, need resilience in the face of today's changing climate? Does my livelihood depend on actionable science coming out of your research? Probably not. But you ask those same questions for my colleague and friend, Brooke Woods, an Athabascan woman whose livelihood and well-being is intricately tied to the resilience of the Yukon River, then yes, 100%. And let me be clear, Brooke does not need help being resilient. As an Indigenous woman and mother, she is the definition of resilience. When I talk about needing resilience, it's not about the people, it's about the ecosystems that they depend on. A study published in Science in 2001 found that Indigenous peoples in the US have lost nearly 99% of their original homelands. I'm sure that's not a surprise to us all here. And the lands to which they were forcibly migrated to are most vulnerable to climate change and contain fewer resources. Yet, as I hinted a moment ago, Indigenous peoples are inherently resilient and have been adapting to the world around them since time immemorial. Their traditional knowledge and intimate understandings of how the world works and is connected is intrinsically holistic, an approach necessary for resilience. It's what we today as Western scientists would call ecosystem-based. Indigenous peoples have been practicing it for generations, long before scientists coined the term. As a result, Indigenous peoples interpret and react to the impacts of climate change in creative ways, drawing on traditional knowledge and other technologies to find solutions which may help society at large to cope with impending changes. Unfortunately, the changes that we are seeing today are happening too fast for Indigenous peoples to adapt. Indigenous peoples are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change due to, of course, their dependence upon and close relationship with the environment and its resources. Not to mention, climate change exacerbates the difficulties already faced by Indigenous communities, including political and economic marginalization, loss of land and resources, human rights violations, discrimination, and unemployment. And since we are here at an aquatic science meeting, I can't talk about Indigenous peoples and water without stating the obvious. Water is sacred, water is life. We have seen this value played out too many times and too many fights that Indigenous peoples must take up to protect their waterways from harmful development. Climate change will only exacerbate the negative impacts of development on waterways vital to our Indigenous communities, making it even more critical to protecting and preserving these waters. I've had the great fortune of working with and for tribes on the Yukon River for over 13 years in Alaska. I've been to every single salmon-dependent community along the 1,300-mile stretch of the river, all 37 of them, and that's quite a feat considering you can only reach 4 of those communities by road and only 1 by a paved road. There is a road that goes to Eagle, Alaska, but I would not recommend that you drive on it. I'm highlighting the Yukon River story today because it exemplifies just how impacted Indigenous communities are by climate challenges. And my thinking and approach to the myriad challenges on the Yukon River have evolved considerably over the years, thanks to the relationships I built with people along the river and the knowledge and experiences that were so generously shared with me. I won't necessarily give you specific examples of lessons learned. Rarely was there ever an aha moment that captured a take-home message for me. Rather, what I want to share with you today is just a lot of little educational moments that have built up over time. The Yukon River encompasses an area larger than the state of Texas. Sorry, Steve Powers. The region is geographically vast with 51 Alaska tribes and 14 Yukon First Nations residing within its boundaries. The in-river fishery is co-managed by the state of Alaska and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is home to all 5 species of Pacific salmon. Unlike lower 48 tribes in Alaska do not have sovereign rights over their land and waters, and so they do not have a seat at the management table. Most of the villages along the Yukon River are small and isolated, and many residents engage in traditional subsistence, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Groceries are flown in by plane, creating untenable prices like $15 for a gallon of milk. So the river and the land are quite literally the region's grocery store. For sake of time, I'm actually just going to skip this because Brooke will share more with you about the importance of salmon to the Indigenous people along the river. I will say that king salmon populations along the Yukon have been in decline for two decades. I think that when a lot of people think of Alaska salmon, they think of bountiful returns of salmon, unparalleled beauty, untouched landscapes. And what we're seeing is actually a crisis in Alaska that I don't think is getting highlighted enough. The king salmon on the Yukon have been in decline, and the last 3 years have been the lowest runs on record. There's no large-scale mining development on the river. There's no dams or other barriers blocking fish passage that we can blame. Size-selective harvests in the past probably contributed to the decline, but fishing has been pretty heavily restricted for the last 10 or more years. The cause of the salmon decline isn't well known, and that's part of the problem, though we suspect climate change is a primary suspect. The decline has happened all while there is less and less money to understand why the salmon have been disappearing. And in my time at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, we went from a robust monitoring system, having multiple projects in the river counting and monitoring fish, to just 2 projects on 1,300 miles of river. Research dollars have been relatively low given the geographic size of the region and the cost to do a project there. A $10 million investment from the state of Alaska to understand Chinook salmon declines did not produce the actionable science we had all hoped for. In 2019, Alaska experienced an exceptionally warm period in early July that resulted in lethal water temperatures for salmon across the state. And on the Yukon River, we saw a large die-off of chum salmon before they had made it to their spawning grounds. Some research had been conducted on Chinook salmon that heat stress in prior years, but it wasn't widely accepted or even known that how much heat stress could be impacting in-river mortality. We are now in a race against time to understand this relationship, and more so, how to mitigate it. What we're seeing play out on the Yukon River is tragic. A way of life, a whole culture is being lost. And just this spring, the state of Alaska signed an agreement with Canada to impose a moratorium on king salmon fishing for the next 7 years. That decision was made without tribal consultation and those most impacted by the decision. Tribes are skeptical this moratorium is the answer, and rightfully so. As one First Nation representative put it, Western policies, Western politics, Western science is what helped get us into this crisis, into this mess. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Brooke Woods, now to share her salmon story. I invited Brooke to join me here today because I felt it was important for her to share her lived experience on the river as an Indigenous person. Brooke wasn't able to join us in person due to family commitments, but she was able to pre-record her segment for us so that her voice and story are still here with us in the room. So we have a video to show.
Before I begin my salmon story, I would like to apologize I'm not able to be with you in person, and I hope the universe brings us together at another time. My name is Brooke Woods. I am Koyakan Dene from Rampart, Alaska, which is on the Yukon River. The native name is Glitha Tanits, which means moose hide hanging. I am a mother, a fisheries science student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I work and reside. I work for Woodwell Climate Research Center on the Permafrost Pathways project. I serve on 10 boards, panels, and commissions for our salmon and our people. And I have been involved in the tribal governance and policy for our salmon fisheries for the last 8 years. And some of this work I've done with Stephanie, who I'm sharing the stage with today. And why this matters, I will share. Before I do that, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I am on the unceded land of the Lower Tanana Dene people. We have 229 tribes in our state, and we have 11 distinct native language families. I would also like to acknowledge the 10,000 years of Indigenous stewardship and care across the nation. It's well known that 80% of our Earth's biodiversity is found in traditional territories. What is the significance of salmon to Indigenous peoples? For me, it is central to who I am as an Indigenous person. And when you look at the dark history of assimilation, there was the intent of taking our Indigenous identities. And you can see that with the loss of our language and some of our cultural practices. I don't speak my language, although my grandmother was full-blooded and spoke her language. I believe that in order to keep her family safe, she did not carry on our language. And I identify very strongly as an Indigenous person with my ability to harvest, process salmon the same way my grandmother did and her ancestors. And it is central to our traditional ways of life. I believe salmon kept our people and our culture alive because that was one thing that was not taken away from us. And we have spiritual and cultural and traditional ways of life that is all around salmon. And it's just incredible that I get to be at my family's fish camp, passing down to my children the same traditions that have sustained our people for 10,000 years. As you can see, salmon is critical to both our physical and mental health. And it also brings health and well-being through our fish camps and our time out on the land, in the water. And salmon strengthens our kinship. Families define who we are, where we come from. Kinship provides a sense of dignity and belonging at birth. And within Indigenous cultures, families have extensive networks of strong connective kinship. Often that encompasses an entire community, and that's so true in my village. We value our care for one another our care for elders and young families. Salmon equate for 61% of our protein intake. And that's so critical because we live in one of the harshest and coldest environments, and salmon keeps our people well throughout the year. This is the current state of our salmon. We have not had the opportunity to fish for Chinook salmon, which is a keystone species, or chum salmon for the last 4 years because we are seeing a multi-species crash of both chum and Chinook. And it has created a cultural crisis as well as a food sovereignty and food security impacts to over 50 communities, both on the Alaskan and Canadian side. And there are implications, one being that we do have a treaty obligation with Canada for our Chinook and chum salmon. And I can't explain the heartbreak and the impacts to the well-being of our people today. But as you can see, our communities are struggling with no salmon. Stephanie is going to explain the very complex dual management system here in Alaska. I believe we're the only state with federal and state management. And these management systems don't respect tribal governance. And it was tribes that made a seat at the table to be a part of management and the governance structure that Stephanie and I have been a part of. And I'm so proud that our tribe stepped up to help restore and protect our salmon in these very difficult management and governance structures. Not only are we seeing multi-species declines, but we're also experiencing anthropogenic and climate impacts. The two anthropogenic impacts that many tribes are pursuing is the pollock trawl sector, and that fishery has high volumes of bycatch of both chum salmon and Chinook salmon, as well as the state of Alaska's Area M fishery, where our chum salmon are intercepted. The other thing that's happening is we're having a climate crisis, both, with our lands and our water, but also with our salmon species. So here in the photo, you can see on the bottom, this is what so many of our families have experienced up until more recent years. Is our salmon were very large, healthy, and older fish. So this elder is standing next to a salmon from the 1950s and the 1960s. And this photo was actually given to me by an elder, and he told me to share this in as many spaces as I can. And on the top photo is a photo of my daughter, who is holding a salmon from most recent years. And as you can see, the size difference is a big concern for us. not only are they experiencing climate change impacts and anthropogenic impacts, but we're also seeing disease in our salmon. So as you can see, our people are very dependent on the land, water, fish, and animals. And the way that we harvest and care for our salmon is very sustainable. We're taught through our traditional values, only take what we need. So this provides for a very sustainable future and one that has maintained our people again for 10,000 years. And one thing I wanted to be able to express is collectively, we need to have an approach that decolonizes our work and our research. And why that matters, you can see that our traditional and cultural practices really honor our land and our water, our salmon, and our animals, and how that incorporates your work and your research really matters today. We are at a place where not only are our salmon being threatened, but also our cultural survival as well. So when I think of decolonizing our research and our work, we also have to challenge the Western systems that we all work in and be in community with tribal communities and people and learn how your work and research is connected to Indigenous communities. I encourage you to sit with an elder, be willing to retrain yourself to understand the importance of traditional knowledge and uplift tribal sovereignty by always consulting with tribal communities and leaders and doing research and work with and for tribes. By doing so, you create meaningful and actionable work, and what's good for Alaskan Native and Indigenous peoples is good for everyone. Today, think about how your research can shift from data and publications to protecting traditional ways of life, respecting traditional knowledge and culture, supporting Indigenous communities facing the climate crisis, and allowing for equity in governance. I want to end by saying our ancestors survived for our children's children to carry on our traditions and cultural practices and their inherent right to fish, hunt, and gather. And that involves so many of you and your work. And right now, it's critical that we work together. And personally, my youngest son, he will not have the ability to go out and fish with us for the next 7 years. And again, such a critical point in our lives, in our work, and our research. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I appreciate being with you virtually. I am going to pass the stage and to Stephanie. Thank you so much.
I'll be sure to share your applause with Brooke. Acknowledging the disparity disadvantaged communities and tribes are facing when it comes to climate change, the Biden-Harris administration has taken up an ambitious approach to addressing the climate crisis. The Justice 40 initiative directs 40% of overall benefits of federal climate, clean energy, affordable and sustainable housing, and other investments to flow directly to disadvantaged communities and tribes. It's a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation funding stream, investing billions of dollars in communities most impacted by climate change and confronting decades of underinvestment in these communities. So I want to say to you today that now is the time to see similar investments in terms of money, time, focus from the academic research community. Many of you are already engaged in actionable science, and I certainly applaud that. But what if all aquatic science researchers dedicated 40% of their research and projects to actionable science serving disadvantaged communities? Such a shift would be transformative, powerful, unprecedented. It would take a major restructuring of the Western academic research value system away from tenure standards that value innovative contributions to the field measured by how much and where you publish, to one that values research and monitoring that contributes to direct community-supported solutions and the number of communities you're working with or the number of meaningful relationships you've built with tribes. Tribal communities need relevant and culturally appropriate monitoring, assessment, and research on their waters and lands, and to be able to develop climate contingency management and mitigation plans. They are overburdened fighting so many other fires that they're not able to get at these critical research and monitoring needs. It's a perfect place for academia to step up and fill in those gaps. With the amount of federal monies coming in and the pace with which our climate is changing, it should be all hands on deck for researchers to do even more actionable science. But what is actionable science from a tribal perspective? Well, first, the research should address issues that are of immediate concern to the tribes. It means listening to the tribes about what their priorities are and then aligning your research with that, not the other way around. Too often, academics go to tribes with an idea before building a relationship with the tribes and getting to know what their needs actually are. Actionable science isn't about you, it's about who it serves. This might mean a simple assessment or monitoring project, and it probably won't get you published in Science or Nature, but it will collect the data that the tribe critically needs to address their climate concerns. The findings should be produced in a time frame that allows for their application to current problems. This often means that actionable science is adaptive and responsive to changing conditions and needs. And for tribal communities, their problems can't take decades for research to solve. It's what we're seeing play out on the Yukon River. The research projects aren't answering the critical questions fast enough. And I can appreciate how challenging it would be to develop a project that would get you solutions or answers so quickly. But I also know that if we in this room can't do it, then who can? Your results should be presented in a way that is understandable and practical for tribes to use. This might involve translating technical data into more accessible formats, creating decision support tools, or providing guidelines for implementation. I'll say that 80% of my job on the Yukon River was communication, taking the science and presenting it in a way that the tribes could use. And my Indigenous colleagues and friends have become incredibly adept at understanding complex fisheries models and surprisingly Bayesian stats. But why is the burden on them to learn and translate if our science is to be truly useful? This characteristic of actionable science is probably the most important one when working with tribes. And in fact, I'd rather just call this piece relationships. Working with tribes is not just a box that you can check. You need to put in the time, and you need to start doing it now. Building relationships is fundamental to working with and for tribes, and I don't mean spending 2 hours in a community and then leaving. I mean spending days with people, visiting with them, being in community and sharing food, listening and hearing their ideas, concerns, and perspectives. Research has historically been unkind to Indigenous communities, and so it's on you to know and understand this trauma and help reconcile it, even if you didn't play a role in it. Build trust and mutual respect, and then you can have meaningful collaboration. With actionable science, the focus is finding solutions to specific problems rather than merely understanding phenomena. And with tribes, This should include traditional knowledge, values, and approaches. Let Indigenous people lead the way in developing these solutions and what works best for them. As an example, the 7-year moratorium on the Yukon was not Indigenous-led and is going to have huge ramifications for people along the river. I mentioned in the beginning about the shift in our thinking and approach necessary to achieve more actionable science in aquatic research. There needs to be a shift to an emphasis on the real-world impact of our research. Success is measured not just by academic outputs, but by tangible improvements in policy, management, or community outcomes for tribes. You'll be less productive by Western metrics, but it will be worth doing because I believe there is a greater good that Western science hasn't fully tapped into. For the sake of time, I won't go into detail about this, but Dr. Andrea Reed has published a framework for doing research in a good way with Indigenous communities, and I believe she gave the Plenary a couple years ago. She's recently published that work in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, and as a starting point, if you want to work with Indigenous communities, I highly recommend that you check out her work. To do research in a good way means that we're doing it in a way that truly benefits to stand Indigenous peoples and lands. It stands to enrich our practice as scientists, not only upholding Indigenous rights, but deeply enriching what and how we know. I'll wrap up here just with a few additional takeaways of working on the Yukon River and working with tribes. This work is hard. And if I haven't mentioned it already, relationships are key. They take time. Start building your relationships now, before you even have a project in mind. Put aside your priorities and elevate tribal priorities, knowledge, and perspectives, and ask what is important to the tribe, and then start thinking about how your skills, your expertise, your research funding can help address those priorities. Slow down. Tribal decisions do not happen quickly. You are dealing with sovereign governments who need to make sure they're acting in the best interests of their tribes. Tribal councils may only meet once a month, and you may have to wait to get your answer, approval, or guidance. If your grant proposal is due next week, or maybe even next month, you're just starting to contact the tribe, it's too late. The best practice would be engaging them before you've even started on the grant. Tribes are responding to numerous fires at any given time. A single email reaching out to them may not be sufficient. Your email is getting buried under hundreds of emails, all demanding the attention of the tribe. So keep trying, keep calling, find someone who can connect you and introduce you. Be incredibly intentional about making your contact. And lastly, you will make mistakes, and this is 100% okay. I'm an Indigenous person, and I have made a lot of mistakes working with tribes. But the key is that I was trying and I was learning. I showed up day after day. You are navigating systems of trauma, distrust, different ways of communicating, different values. Have some humility, grace, and compassion in this work. Be genuine and have good intentions, and keep doing the hard work. I can assure you that the most fulfilling work that I've done working with tribes has always been the hardest. I'll wrap up and say my First Nation friend wasn't wrong when he said Western policies, Western politics, Western science is what helped get us into this crisis, into this mess. But he also said traditional knowledge will help get us out. And I couldn't agree more. It's time to shift our thinking, shift our approach, and indigenize it. What have we got to lose? To Putney, thank you. If there is one question, we have time for it, and I'll be around today and part of tomorrow if you'd like to find me and ask additional questions. Great, you can find me and we can leave some time for additional announcements. Thank you so much.